Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak to Bill C-38, and I am very saddened by it because this bill is the worst piece of legislation of this entire Parliament for two reasons. First, because the government chose to present fundamental changes to a number of bills that affect aspects of Canadian life in terms of the environment, society, and environmental, and it's done so illegitimately and in a scandalous fashion. This process is unacceptable and anti-democratic.
The process that's so offensive, this bill that purports to be a budget bill is in substance something quite different. And the substance of the changes is equally alarming. Laws this bad take some explanation. And as I've sat through the truncated debate on this process at second reading, what we've had are presentations from the government side, the Conservative MPs, basically providing lists of things they like in the legislation, and from the opposition benches, lists of things we don't like in this legislation. That, Mr. Speaker, I think leaves out a big piece of the puzzle. We've also been confusing measures that are actually budget measures that are not in Bill C-38, things like fighting the deficit, and things that we don't like killing the Centre for Plant Health in my own riding, which is necessary to protect the health of the economy, and particularly the grape-growing regions and wineries, and killing jobs in national parks, again in my riding of Sandwich Gulf Islands, the Gulf Islands National Park jobs and ecological work. But these, again, are not in Bill C-38. So the debate has been combating lists. We like this, we hate this. I want to step back and try to understand what's going on here. Why do we have this enormous package of measures, most of the substantial changes being those that unravel environmental law in this country? I've been involved in the development of most of the laws that we now see being unveiled and unraveled, particularly the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the National Roundtable Act. And what I see behind all this is a shift in mindset. Now, I worked in the Mulroney government. I understood at that point that progressive conservatives understood that conserving involved conserving the environment. This is not necessarily this current mindset of the current brand of conservatism. I find alien from the traditions and roots of people like former fisheries ministers John Fraser and Tom Siddon, both of whom have spoken out against the devastating changes to the protection of fish habitat and the unintended consequences that that will surely have. No, this mindset reminds me most of what the former senior economist to the World Bank, Herman Daly, used to describe as treating the planet as a business in liquidation. An everything must go mentality, and it must be done fast. He offered the opposite view, and again, senior economist at the World Bank said, we need to understand that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. These things are not in conflict, and it is so wrong-headed to say that we'll only get jobs if we destroy the environment. It boggles the mind, and when you understand that that's the way this entire omnibus budget bill has been prepared, then it begins to make sense. Then you understand the narrative. Then you can understand that someone in PMO picked up the phone and called Justice, or maybe they just sent an email, and said, find all those things that the federal government is responsible for the environment, and find ways to withdraw from them to the maximum extent possible without offending constitutional requirements to protect such things as migratory birds because we have a convention with the U.S., or fisheries because that's in the Constitution. For example, there's no other way to understand why they repealed the Environmental Assessment Act and put in place an entirely new act. Most of what we've heard is that we wanted to have timely assessments. I don't think there'd be much debate over that. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, in 2005, I proposed to the Minister of Environment that in order to get a review of the proposed cleanup at the Sydney tar ponds, which itself presented risks, a timeline would be a good idea. In fact, they put in place a 12-month timeline for the joint review panel of the cleanup proposed for the Sydney tar ponds back in 2005. You can do that under the existing legislation. You don't need to repeal the act and start over. And for all these complaints that industry was demanding that this be done, Mr. Speaker, I have in front of me a briefing note from the Mining Association of Canada from January of this year, in which the Mining Association of Canada praises the current process under environmental assessment review. They say that the amendments to the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act made in 2010 were implemented quickly and competently by the agency, have provided mining project proponents with relief. They're saying for the first time, provincial and federal assessments are synchronized. This is the Mining Association of Canada, allegedly one of the interest groups for whom this government is destroying all of our environmental laws. The Mining Association says, quote, our primary interest in the review of the Environmental Assessment Act is to convey support for the new system brought in and to renew funding for the Environmental Assessment Agency. So it's critical to understand that you did not need to repeal the Environmental Assessment Act in order to have a process that worked for all the players. It looks as though this desperate attempt to be in a hurry is where the problem lies. And what it's done, Mr. Speaker, is so egregious. The Environmental Assessment Act being repealed and replaced with a whole new scheme is never going to get proper review through the process we're having in an omnibus project. They are removing what had always been a federal trigger for a proper environmental assessment if federal money was being spent. That's no longer there. They're removing comprehensive studies. They're no longer there. There's no real definition of what an environmental assessment will be. We have a reference in the budget document to something called a standard environmental assessment, but having removed all definitions of what the process looks like, having killed comprehensive studies, having created panels that can be substituted to the province without any criteria, in my view, I think you're going to find the industry coming to you soon and saying, what have you done? The process was working pretty well. In fact, the Mining Association says very well. And now we're not going to know what project is going to have to go to a review, what project isn't, when we go to the province, when we don't. And at the same time, in order to unravel the federal responsibilities that ever triggered an environmental assessment, we have created a crazy scheme for fisheries. We are still requiring a permit to add substances deleterious to fish, but we've removed the protections for fish habitat, meaning that if you wanted to have a large-scale project where you wanted to, for instance, and this is, as we all know, a real-life example, put tailings into an existing lake, you'd be better off, if your lake is in a remote area where no one's fishing, to drain the whole lake, kill all the fish, and destroy all the whole habitat, because that would be legal without an authorization, whereas adding substances deleterious to fish to the existing lake would require an authorization. This is the ultimate example of haste makes waste. This is a bill that has not been properly contemplated, not the changes to the Fisheries Act, not the changes to the Environmental Assessment Act, not the changes to the Species at Risk Act. This is a bill out of control through the false notion that we will create jobs through waste and haste. I remind people that we are now 20 years since the Westray disaster. 26 men died. There was no environmental review at that time. It was back in 1988 the project was approved. But there were warnings. The experts in the Department of Mines said that area is too high in methane. Oh, but no, the local politicians and some federal politicians wanted those jobs, and they wanted them so badly that they overrode expert advice. They said, we have to get that Westray mine built come hell or high water, and we're going to do it. We don't want to hear your complaining about long, good process that might happen to get in the way. So federal money flowed. And we created a bomb, and we put men in it, and 26 men died. And now we're creating another kind of bomb, Mr. Speaker. The first speaker on this bill was not the Minister of Fisheries or Minister of Finance, but it was the Minister of Natural Resources, who brought forward all the reasons that we had to change the scheme. He said, we must hurry. There is no time to waste. And he quoted from the International Energy Agency on the current state of fossil fuel requirements around the world. But he never quoted the warnings from the International Energy Agency that if we don't act on the climate crisis, it'll soon be too late. The quote from the International Energy Agency from earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, is this, quote, delaying action is a false economy. As each year passes without clear signals to drive investment in clean energy, the lock-in of high-carbon infrastructure is making it harder and more expensive to meet our energy security and climate goals. We must change direction, and this bill is putting pedal to the metal to go as fast as possible to a very large brick wall. Going back to the bomb we built for the men in Westray, we're now building a climate bomb, a carbon bomb, And this legislation is so wrong-headed, it must be withdrawn in its entirety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.